to the American people right now and said, well, we're just not going to make it as a country unless we give $9 billion to Harvard that's sitting on $53 billion, you'd get your ass kicked, I imagine, in a political campaign. Now, don't misunderstand. I wish Harvard would actually work something out here. I do agree that these universities are important. They do important work. But I don't agree that we need to continue to fund people who won't listen to us when we say, you have problems. I would argue that it's a national security problem that these Ivy League colleges are turning out people who fundamentally hate Western civilization.
And that's the fundamental question, right? These universities churning out people who hate Western civilization. Once the great universities of the West were cathedrals of the mind, born from the Christian conviction that truth exists and is worth pursuing. The medieval university was built on a theological foundation anchored in the belief that reason and revelation were not at odds but intertwined. And to be educated meant to be formed intellectually, morally, and also spiritually. Oxford, Harvard, and Yale did not just teach. They catechized. Their mission wasn't job training or activist grooming. It was the cultivation of wisdom and the search for truth grounded in the dignity of man made in the image of God. But that vision has collapsed. Today's universities are no longer centers of truth, but fortresses of ideology. Post-structuralist thought hollowed out the curriculum, replacing beauty and order with critique and deconstruction. Objective truth became a colonial artifact. Logic, a tool of oppression. The humanities were gutted and replaced with grievance studies. And meanwhile, the institutions themselves ballooned into tax-sheltered hedge funds, harvesting billions in endowment profits, often with more investment managers and full-time faculty. Harvard's endowment exceeds $50 billion. It's managed by a sprawling investment office that channels billions into private equity, hedge funds, global markets, reaping enormous tax-free returns under the legal shelter of its nonprofit status. And despite this immense wealth, Harvard continues to receive billions in federal funding through research grants, contracts, student aid, amounting to billions. As of yesterday, however, the funds were frozen. Yet yesterday, the Trump admin froze over $2.2 billion in grants and $60 million in contracts to Harvard University. And the Trump administration's letter to Harvard is an unprecedented move. It's part of ideological correction that has needed to happen for a long time, an institutional reckoning. It demands the shutdown of DEI offices, a return to merit-based hiring and admissions, audits of viewpoint diversity across departments, and the dismantling of activist programs like the Religion and Public Life program and the Carr Center for Human Rights. And it even proposes banning face masks and defunding student groups like Students for Justice in Palestine. Now, I'm going to be straight with you guys. This is not a cookie cutter issue. I'm not going to pander to anyone. You're here, and I'm going to give you my honest, nuanced opinion about what's happening here in this latest Trump move. Most of these demands are incredibly reasonable, and not only reasonable, but essential and long overdue. One of these measures, I think, goes a little too far, especially those that risk policing student speech, like the banning of certain student groups. And I want to address that first because I love a lot of things about this. It's just this one issue that I have to address. So let me be clear. I believe in radical free speech in general, but especially student-free inquiry. College campuses need to be open to the freedom of thought and expression. They have to be. You can't learn unless you're allowed to explore every possibility. And that includes a student's right to criticize Israel, a foreign government, I might add. Students are allowed to have these conversations. It even includes the idea of free speech, believe it or not, supporting Hamas. Yeah, I know that this may be a shock to some of you, but American citizens on American college campuses are allowed to say that they like the horrific things that Hamas has done. And by the way, I've seen very little, if any, evidence that a lot of students are saying they love Hamas. Certainly some of them are. It's not the majority of them. at least by my observations. But even if they were the majority saying that they love Hamas and they love terrorism, which again is obscene, these students are allowed to say horrible things. The First Amendment is here to protect disfavorable speech. Favorable speech doesn't need protection. It will never need protection. That's not the point of the First Amendment. And I'm never going to cheer on silencing or punishing students for their politics, no matter how much I disagree with them, because this is a principled stand. Now, taking over college campuses and occupying buildings and preventing people from attending class, that's one thing, and it should not be tolerated. Simply having a Justice in Palestine group where like-minded people get together, that should be allowed. There's a difference between these two things. One is breaking the rules, potentially breaking the law. The other is just expressing free inquiry, ideas that may be repugnant, but are allowed under the First Amendment. Again, there is this thing called free speech and freedom of thought that in America we generally protect and care about. And it applies even if you don't like what's being said. Now, at the same time, I'm also not going to pretend like Harvard is a victim. There's a huge difference between messy campus speech and entire academic departments being run by ideologues instead of scholars. And when the administration demands that Harvard reduce the power held by faculty more committed to activism than scholarship, it's targeting a real and festering problem. Fields captured by neo-Marxism, I'm talking about CRT, gender theory, fat studies, they've replaced truth-seeking with activism, and it's time to draw a line. And of course, the administration is right to insist that the university cease all race-based diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in administration and admissions. This is just a no-brainer. You can't be deciding who gets a promotion, who gets a job, who gets into the university based on immutable qualities. It's an absurd anti-American thing to do. Again, I'm glad that this is being addressed by the Trump admin. Again, Harvard operates like a $50 billion tax-exempt hedge fund, bloated with prestige and federal money, while rejecting any accountability to the society that funds it. The government isn't required to bankroll any of that. An investment is not an entitlement, the letter from the Trump admin rightfully states. If Harvard wants total independence, it can decline the money and live off its endowment. But as long as it's feeding at the taxpayer trough, it's fair for the public to demand reforms. So no, it isn't a clean or comfortable take here. I realize that. And you guys are used to that. Usually I have a very strong opinion on these things, and I can give you a very cookie cutter take where it's all cut and dry, black and white. No ifs, ands, or buts. This takes some nuance. I oppose censorship of student protest, but I support gutting the activist bureaucracies that have corrupted the mission of higher education. Free speech must remain. Ideological capture must end. Now, Harvard has, of course, hit back at the Trump admin, and the school wrote yesterday, the university will not surrender its independence or relinquish its constitutional rights. Neither Harvard nor any other private university can allow itself to be taken over by the federal government. So Harvard is very upset. I think Obama, who is, of course, a Harvard law grad, also weighed in support of his former school. So Obama is against the Trump admin. Obama is pretending like he cares about free speech now. And to that, I say, good. The Trump admin has hit back in a really great way and threatened to take away their tax-exempt status. And I also want to point out, again, this is a nuanced take. I'm not trying to leave anything out here. I want to be honest. Has Harvard been open to the free inquiry of ideas? Are they an institution that really has cared about free speech? And the answer to that is, of course, no. This is a left-wing steeped campus. They have previous hate speech codes and safe spaces and have discriminated against conservative students left and right. So I am being intellectually consistent here and saying we have to support free speech across the board. Harvard is using free speech now as an excuse to defend itself when it has never in the past cared about free speech. I think it's important to know that context and to acknowledge that as we talk about this. These schools are cynical shells of their former selves. This is why I don't feel so bad for Harvard. This is why they don't have a lot to stand on in this fight. It's prestige without purpose, wealth without wisdom. The universities no longer form thinkers. They fund bureaucrats and they create agitators. It enforces conformity while posturing as a marketplace of ideas. And it clings to its federal subsidies and moral preening, and it forgets the one thing that made it great, the humility to seek truth rather than to invent it. And in trading truth for power and virtue for vanity, higher education is not only betraying its roots, it has destroyed itself from within.